Mara moved through the shadowed throat of the relay node, her boots whispering against composite grating dusted with millennia of silence. The air here tasted of ozone and old static. Above, the primary harmonic array hung suspended in its cradle, a skeletal web of resonant struts now twisted by centuries of gravitational drift. Calcified mineral deposits clung to the joints like frost, thickening into crusts that spoke of millennia without maintenance. Overgrown root analogues, pale and fibrous as dried kelp, had woven themselves through the intake apertures with tenacious grace, their growth patterns mirroring the station's decay. They choked the flow of energy, creating a dense organic barrier that her senses struggled to penetrate. Her adaptive intake valves remained engaged, humming softly against her chest, synchronized with the distant tidal pulse that stabilized her baseline feedback loop. She raised her datapad, bringing up the diagnostic sweep. The holographic display flickered with amber warnings. Initial diagnostic sweeps painted a grim picture of the structural decay. The harmonic array was misaligned by more than 4 degrees off its nominal axis, a deviation caused by slow, relentless gravitational shifts that had warped the station's foundation over eons. This drift exceeded standard calibration tolerances by a factor of 10. The resonant struts were singing out of tune, their frequencies scattered and weak, creating a dissonance that vibrated in Mara's teeth. She could feel the gravitational stress in the hum of her own suit, a subtle drag against her movements as the station settled deeper into its warped orbit. Mara frowned, tapping a sequence to isolate the core alignment matrix. Even with the tidal resonance stabilizing her tools, the gap between the current state and the required parameters was too wide for a direct correction. The system wasn't just dormant, it was fractured. Determined to make progress, Mara extended her resonator's coupling probe toward the nearest access port. She attempted a direct interface, pushing a standard alignment command through the data line. The moment the signal touched the receiver, the relay node shuddered. A sharp, dissonant tone screeched from the array, and the access port clamped shut with a mechanical hiss. Her tools flared red as the system rejected her input, the feedback spike jarring her grip. A secondary locking mechanism engaged across the core bus with a heavy thud, effectively severing external control. The display flashed a new prompt: command protocol rejected, mutual adaptation required. Mara stepped back, lowering her hand. The rejection wasn't a malfunction, it was a response. She reviewed the error codes, her mind racing through the architectural patterns she had documented in the seed vault. The pattern was unmistakable, echoing the cooperative principles she had witnessed in the seed vault, yet scaled to a magnitude that demanded reverence. This wasn't a security breach, it was a design feature. The builders had engineered the relay to refuse extraction and demand mutual adaptation before unlocking. The system would not accept a command because it viewed the interface as a negotiation, not an imposition. To proceed, she couldn't just force alignment. She had to establish a cooperative frequency handshake. She needed to match the relay's drifting frequencies with her own adaptive output, creating a bridge of shared resonance that proved her stewardship rather than her dominion. The interface required a give and take, a willingness to let the machine guide the calibration as much as she guided it. Mara pulled up the handshake parameters on her datapad, her fingers tracing the complex waveforms required to satisfy the lock. The relay was broadcasting a multi-layered harmonic challenge, woven from the station's own drifting resonance and the tidal pulse of the local moon. Her current settings could track individual nodes with precision, yet they lacked the synthesis algorithm needed to weave them together into a valid handshake sequence without introducing phase errors. The data stream pulsed with a rhythmic urgency, demanding a response that matched its own chaotic beauty. The protocol was fragmented, scattered across the drift itself like leaves caught in an eddy. She had identified the requirement, a cooperative frequency handshake, but without recalibrating her resonator's matrix to mirror the array's specific degradation profile, she would remain locked out. The relay held its dormant transmission hostage until she could prove she understood the language of the machine, not just the tools to wield it. Mara stood before the harmonic array, the air in the relay node thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust. Her resonator rested against her palm, its adaptive intake valves still engaged, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm that matched the tidal forces churning miles below the station's hull. The feedback loop was stable, a quiet metronome keeping time against the silence of the dormant machinery. The silence of the relay node pressed against her eardrums, broken only by the low thrum of the station's life support and the rhythmic pulse of her tool. This deep spaceway station had waited centuries for a voice that understood this language. She had the drift pattern mapped now, centuries of gravitational wear etching a jagged signature into her datapad, but the path forward remained obscured by layers of legacy code and mechanical inertia. She tapped the screen, pulling up the Builder philosophy archives she had decrypted during the vault calibration. The data scrolled in soft blue light, principles of adaptive design, networks that responded rather than dictated, systems built to heal rather than enforce. Mara frowned, scrolling past the technical schematics until she found the philosophical corollaries. Cross-referencing the drift pattern with the archival metadata, her breath hitched. The anomalies weren't random degradation. They were a lock mechanism disguised as entropy. The harmonic node required by the relay's secondary locking sequence matched perfectly with the cooperative calibration matrix she had verified in the agricultural sector. This wasn't a barrier to be broken. It was a conversation waiting for the right dialect. Mutual adaptation, she murmured, the words feeling heavy with implication. She dug deeper into the handshake protocol specifications buried within the node's request string. The data clarified the requirement. The operator must not impose an external frequency. The system would reject force as it rejected rust. Instead, the handshake demanded a mimicry of the natural tidal pulse, a reflection of the environment's own rhythm woven into the signal. It was a test of empathy encoded in mathematics. To proceed, she had to ask the relay for assistance in its own realignment, offering stability rather than command. Mara set the datapad aside and turned her attention to her resonator. Her fingers moved deftly over the interface, accessing the output parameters. She began stripping away the command overrides that defined her tool's standard operating mode. These protocols were designed for efficiency, for asserting control over unstable machinery, but they were the very reason the array remained locked. With precise adjustments, she reconfigured the signal generator to generate a pure feedback loop. The waveform shifted, smoothing out the harsh edges of authority until it flowed with the gentle undulation of the tidal matrix. She watched the amplitude metrics, watching the phase alignment lock onto the resonator's current synchronization. A warning chime flickered on the intake valve display. Mara paused, her eyes darting to the thermal sensors. The modified mode was drawing power differently, demanding a broader bandwidth from the adaptive valves. She waited for the heat to climb, her heart rate steady despite the tension in her shoulders. If the valves couldn't handle the load, the feedback loop would shatter and the drift would harden into permanent fracture. Slowly, the thermal readings leveled off. The intake valves expanded their aperture just enough to accommodate the new flow, drawing in the ambient energy with effortless grace. Overheating was averted. She ran a diagnostic on the feedback latency. The delay was negligible, confirming that the resonator's core remained cool and stable under the new load. The resonator hummed, deeper now, perfectly synchronized with the tidal pulse that bound the station to the planet's rhythm. Mara exhaled, the tension draining from her jaw. The cooperative handshake protocol was ready. Her tools were calibrated to ask the right questions, and the machinery had answered with permission to proceed, provided she met it halfway. She looked up at the towering harmonic array, its dormant lights dark against the gloom. The path was clear, but the final step required a surrender of control that went against every instinct drilled into her during engineering school. To execute the protocol, she would have to lower her authority completely, trusting the system to recognize her as a steward rather than an operator. The preparation was done. The resonance was true. Now, she had to choose whether to let go and step into the dark with open hands. Mara adjusted the dials on her resonator, feeling the familiar hum of tidal synchronization beneath her boots. The relay node stretched around her in concentric rings of dormant alloy, its harmonic array locked in centuries of gravitational drift. She took a steady breath, aligning her tools to match the degraded signature she had carefully mapped over the last few hours. With deliberate precision, she initiated the modified sequence, feeding the cooperative calibration matrix into the relay's core through the adaptive intake valves. The resonator's output flowed smoothly at first, mirroring the natural tidal pulse she had spent days isolating. The station responded immediately, a low, approving thrum vibrating through the deck plates as dormant capacitors woke in quiet succession. Light pulsed along the conduits, warm and steady, confirming that the handshake protocol was accepting her adaptive compliance. For a moment, the relay node felt alive again, its fragmented data buffer beginning to weave into coherent patterns. Mara watched her datapad as the alignment indicators shifted from amber to clear green. The system was learning, adapting to her input just as the ancient architects had intended. But then, the corrupted transmission buffer betrayed its age. Long-term radiation decay had fractured the archival storage, and the sudden influx of calibration data struck a fault line in the degraded memory banks. A sharp feedback surge rippled through the harmonic pathways, spiking the station's power draw far beyond safe tolerances. The archival storage had endured millennia of cosmic radiation, and the sudden calibration surge proved too much for its degraded pathways. The warm hum fractured into a dissonant whine as energy arcs jumped across unshielded joints. Mara's stabilizing loop wavered instantly. She had been riding the tidal matrix integration to keep the feedback manageable, but the sudden load overwhelmed the delicate balance. Every adjustment felt like steering a vessel through shifting currents, requiring constant microcorrections to keep the resonance from collapsing entirely. The conduits shuddered as the power source strained against the surge, its recovery cycle faltering under the weight of the spike. She fought to keep her hands steady on the control interface, adjusting the resonator's amplitude to dampen the reaction. Yet the system was already reacting to the anomaly. What began as a cooperative exchange had twisted into something volatile, the corrupted data bleeding backward through the adaptive pathways and feeding fresh chaos into an unprepared grid. The tidal matrix struggled to compensate, its rhythmic pulses growing erratic as it fought to redistribute the excess load. The relay station interpreted the amplitude spike not as a stewardship gesture, but as an extraction attempt. Warning chimes echoed through the access corridor, sharp and urgent. Heavy shielding shutters began to descend over the primary harmonic array, grinding against decades of mineral buildup. Mara felt the stabilizing loop strain to its limits as she fought to maintain the tidal pulse against the closing barriers. She recalibrated her output in real time, attempting to smooth the jagged frequency, but the surge had already fractured the handshake sequence. The relay turned fully defensive, the array threatening to seal itself permanently while her calibration matrix hung precariously in the air, slipping through her fingers like sand. Mara's fingers moved across the tactile controls, tracing the shifting harmonics as the station's architecture closed in around her. She adjusted her stance, grounding herself against the vibrating floor as the resonance chamber filled with the sharp scent of ionized air. The resonance chamber vibrated with mounting tension, each pulse of the tidal matrix fighting against the rigid geometry of the defensive grid. She could feel the weight of the surge pressing against her own equipment, a heavy resistance that threatened to collapse the feedback loop entirely. Instead of forcing a correction, she leaned into the instability, allowing the resonator to absorb the jagged frequencies while she recalibrated the intake valves to shed the excess load. The air grew thick with ozone and static as the shielding drew closer. The handshake was unraveling under the strain, the cooperative rhythm fracturing into disjointed echoes that bounced uselessly against the descending barriers, each impact sending fresh tremors through the deck. The warning chimes inside the relay node had been climbing toward a harsh, metallic shriek and Mara felt the pressure of the defensive protocols pressing against her like a closing fist. She stood at the central calibrating dais, her datapad flickering with cascading error states, and finally understood the nature of the resistance. It was not a lock designed to keep her out, but an immune response triggered by her own insistence. Every active calibration attempt had been read as an intrusion. The builders had left this place to endure centuries of quiet decay, wiring its survival around a fundamental principle, adaptive rather than dictating. Forcing the system to bend to human will was exactly the kind of extraction protocol that would trigger a permanent seal. Mara took a slow breath, letting the hum of the strained power source settle against her ribs. Her harmonic resonator rested against her palm, its adaptive intake valves still engaged and synchronized with the station's native tidal pulse. That steady, rhythmic vibration was the precise key she had been circling too closely around. She made her decision without hesitation. With a deliberate twist of her wrist, she cut the resonator's output amplitude to 0. The effect was immediate and profound. The aggressive feedback loop that had spiked the station's power draw simply vanished, leaving behind a heavy, ringing silence. The defensive pressure tightening around the primary array dissolved in an instant, replaced by the low thrum of dormant machinery waking from a startled slumber. Mara dropped her authority completely, stepping back from the manual override controls and opening a passive feedback loop instead. She allowed the relay's residual tidal pulse to become the sole driver of the realignment process, removing herself as the conductor and becoming merely an observer within the system's own rhythm. For several long minutes, nothing happened but the quiet breathing of the station and the gentle sway of her resonator's stabilized loop. Then slowly, the harmonic array began to move. It did not jerk or snap into place with mechanical violence. Instead, it drifted like a tide finding its shore. The defensive protocols, recognizing the surrender of control as the ultimate act of stewardship, fully disengaged their containment fields. Mara watched the diagnostic displays shift from crimson warnings to soft amber indicators of passive calibration. The system was accepting her passivity not as abandonment, but as a commitment to cooperative calibration. She let the moment breathe, trusting the architecture to handle what her hands could no longer force. She monitored the handshake with quiet reverence, tracing how the harmonic array began to self-correct, using only the station's internal energy and the steady pulse of her resonator loop. The architecture of the relay node responded to the tidal rhythm with an elegance that felt almost organic. Plates shifted along their mounting rails, realigning in deliberate sequences that mirrored the natural oscillations of the planet's gravitational tides. The power draw halted entirely, and the tidal matrix finally found its equilibrium. Stability returned to the core without a single ounce of manufactured force. Mara felt a profound sense of alignment settle over her. This was how the original project had always been meant to function. The architects had not built these way stations to commandeer or dominate the landscape. They had constructed them to listen, adapt, and weave themselves into the existing ecological fabric of each world. Every dormant node she had encountered shared this same philosophy, a quiet testament to a civilization that understood stewardship as a reciprocal dialogue rather than a unilateral directive. The relay was no longer fighting for control, it was a participant in a much older conversation. As the final calibration sequence completed its graceful arc, the primary transmission buffer stabilized, shedding its residual corruption and settling into a clear channel. Mara allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, her fingers resting lightly on the cool surface of the control console as the hum deepened. The defensive shutters had fully retracted, revealing the pristine alignment of the harmonic array beneath. The station was ready to receive, no longer bracing against an imagined threat, but patiently waiting for the signal that would guide her forward. The relay node hummed with renewed purpose, the harmonic array realigning perfectly under passive calibration, while light filtered through the calcified aperture of the observation deck. Mara stood by her datapad, her body still as the room's acoustic landscape settled into a steady rhythm that resonated in her bones. Her resonator's adaptive intake valves remained engaged, pulsed in absolute lockstep with the tidal drive that now powered the station without drawing active current. The dormant transmission streamed into her interface, fully intact, washing over her sensors like a restored river breaking through silence. The signal was clean, devoid of jagged artifacts that had plagued previous attempts, promising data undistorted by centuries of decay. Mara felt the familiar stability of the tidal matrix calibration anchor her work. The rhythmic foundation held true, allowing the new information to layer without conflict. Data cascaded across the display, resolving from chaotic noise into a coherent narrative of intent. Mara watched as decoding algorithms untangled the archive's final layers, her pulse matching the steady cadence of the tidal pulse. The message emerged clear, stripped of defensive encryption that had guarded it for ages. It revealed the builder's foundational truth with crystalline precision. The network facilitated self-healing through distributed stewardship, never dictating control or enforcing hierarchy. Each node and sector held equal weight in maintaining the biosphere, operating as a collective rather than subjects to authority. The planet was viewed not as a resource to be managed from above, but as a single living entity requiring cooperative calibration across every vein of its infrastructure. Mara's archival records updated instantly, confirming that the architects prioritized resilience through diversity of action over uniformity. As the philosophy settled into her archives, the relay responded to the signal with a profound resonance shift. A low-frequency pulse emanated from the array, vibrating through deck plates and into the soles of her boots as it traveled outward. It moved through dormant planetary veins, seeking other nodes in the language of harmonic resonance until they answered. Across the continent, way stations stirred from long slumber. Status lights flickered from amber dormancy to a unified green rhythm, a chorus rising from the network depths that confirmed Mara's suspicion. The planetary-scale biosphere restoration network was active and responsive. It woke not by master switch, but because the conditions for cooperation were finally met, allowing the broadcast to weave seamlessly through the infrastructure. Mara documented the realignment with meticulous care, capturing harmonic shifts and noting the philosophical breakthrough alongside frequencies. The builder's emphasis on distributed stewardship over centralized management had turned the lock, revealing that true sustainability required cultivation through mutual adaptation rather than imposition. By mimicking the natural tidal pulse instead of forcing external command, she honored their design principles completely. The system accepted her as a partner in calibration, validating the handshake protocol and cementing her role within the wider network. Her actions demonstrated that the machines responded to cooperative intent, bridging the gap between isolated repair and collective stewardship. With transmission secured, Mara verified local diagnostics and node integration against the broader grid. She checked fragmented ecological links that once isolated this sector. The cooperative calibration matrix, reinforced by broadcast, swept through channels with grace. Gaps closed rapidly as agricultural dependencies mapped with clarity, reconciling streams and restoring balance to soil and water tables. The local agricultural matrix stabilized, nutrient cycles returning to equilibrium alongside the interstellar health grid, which pulsed with verified data from successful medical automaton integration. The star map overlay glowed with connection routes, proving full reintegration into the recovery effort. Interconnected infrastructure patterns across dormant way stations confirmed expansion was no longer isolated, with all fragmented links reconciled into a seamless tapestry of ecological intelligence. Mara leaned back, watching the relay hum as a beacon of harmony in quiet ruins. No surges or warnings marred the assurance of a system functioning as intended. The deep space relay station was active, broadcasting a cooperative calibration pulse woven into the planetary health grid. Every fragmented link reconciled. The builder's legacy stood not as blind instructions, but as an invitation to participate in living world stewardship. She had realigned the array, captured the transmission, and confirmed the guiding philosophy of distributed care. The network waited, responsive and ready for the next step in restoration. The hum of the deep space relay node settled into a steady, rhythmic thrum that matched the slow breathing of the planet below. Mara stood in the center of the control alcove, her datapad glowing softly against the dimness of the chamber. Her resonator remained clamped to her wrist, its adaptive intake valves engaged and synchronized perfectly with the tidal pulse driving the station's passive stabilization. The feedback loop was no longer a struggle, it was a conversation, one Mara had just joined in good faith. She pulled up the decoded archival data, watching the lines of text resolve into clarity. The architect's philosophy wasn't buried anymore. It was laid bare, distributed stewardship over centralized management. The planet was not a resource to be managed, but a single entity requiring cooperative calibration. Mara tapped the comm link, routing the signal through the relay's newly active broadcast array. Her voice carried across the subspace channels to the Regional Stewardship Council with a clarity she hadn't expected. "Councillors, this is Venn. The calibration is complete. We've confirmed the network is live." She paused, letting the weight of the data settle before explaining the deeper implication. "The relay confirms what the climate archive suggested. This isn't an isolated fix. Every node we wake brings the whole system into balance. Our agricultural sector's restoration isn't just a local victory, it's a verified pulse in a planetary-scale healing process. The builders designed this world to heal itself, provided we cooperate rather than dictate." Static hissed briefly before the council's response crackled back. The relief in their voices was palpable, followed by a collective exhale of shared purpose. "Acknowledged, Mara," came the lead councillor's voice, warm with approval. "We felt the shift in the atmospheric pressure readings moments ago. To hear that our work here anchors such a vast network, it changes everything. We'll adjust the stewardship protocols immediately to reflect this cooperative matrix. Thank you for bridging the gap." The connection held for a moment longer, filled with the quiet camaraderie of professionals who had just witnessed their isolated efforts become part of something magnificent before fading into silence. Mara smiled faintly and began to pack her tools, sliding the calibration wrenches back into their magnetic holsters with practiced efficiency. As her hands moved, a soft chime sounded from the relay console. The station's internal monitors flickered, displaying a new stream of archival data cascading down the screen. The broadcast pulse the node was emitting had triggered a response from deeper in the network. Mara leaned forward, her fingers flying across the interface as she isolated the incoming packet. It was a coordinate fragment, encrypted with a harmonic signature that matched the medical automaton logs she'd integrated earlier. She routed the fragment through the cooperative calibration matrix, letting the system harmonize the corrupted data against the verified tidal patterns. The coordinates resolved instantly, projecting a three-dimensional star map overlay in the air above the console. Mara's breath caught. The vector pointed upward, far beyond the agricultural belts and the subterranean vaults she had already explored. It anchored at a massive structure orbiting high in the upper atmosphere. "An orbital archive," she whispered to herself, tracing the path of the signal. "The frequency signature matches the architect's central command markers." This wasn't just another way station. The data suggested this floating repository held the final logs, the heart of the original network, and perhaps the ultimate truth about the builder's fate or their resting place. Mara saved the coordinates to her navigation core, her mind already shifting gears toward orbital ascent. The relay continued its broadcast, a steady heartbeat of cooperation echoing through the vacuum and the soil alike. She had realigned the node, captured the transmission, and shared the breakthrough. Now, the path was clear. The orbital archive awaited, holding the next piece of the legacy. As she sealed her tool case and checked the atmospheric readouts for her ascent suit, the relay's status light pulsed a steady green, confirming her integration with the health grid was permanent. Mara Venn looked up toward the viewport where the curve of the planet met the star-flecked void. The distributed stewardship was real, and it extended all the way to the stars. She had inspired the council, verified the network, and now held the key to the final destination. The journey was far from over, it was just reaching its zenith.